Occupied France, August 1943. The B-17 flying fortresses, massive silver beasts, lumbered eastward, their bomb bays heavy with destruction, destined for Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Below them, the Luftwaffe waited, their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s poised for the inevitable, deadly confrontation. Allied escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, could only accompany the bombers for a fraction of the journey, their internal fuel capacity limiting their reach. This left the bombers exposed, hundreds of miles deep within enemy territory, a vulnerability the German pilots exploited with brutal efficiency. Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Lange, a squadron leader with Jagdgeschwader 26, watched the distant contrails from his cockpit, a faint smile playing on his lips. His FW-190A4, a rugged, powerful machine, was a hunter designed for this precise moment. He knew the P-47s, robust and well-armed, could outdive and outclimb his aircraft at certain altitudes. But their range was a constant, predictable limitation. The American pilots, fresh from their training, often pressed their luck, only to be forced to turn back, leaving their charges defenseless. The operational reports from July indicated that nearly 20% of unescorted bomber formations were intercepted and significantly damaged or destroyed. This attrition rate was unsustainable, a slow bleed that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign. The P-47's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, a marvel of engineering delivering over 2,000 horsepower, consumed fuel at a prodigious rate, especially at combat power settings. Its internal tanks held 305 gallons, providing an operational radius of approximately 300 miles. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin Allison V1710 engines and greater internal fuel capacity of 400 gallons, offered a slightly extended reach, pushing its combat radius to about 400 miles. Yet even this was insufficient for the deep penetrations required for targets in central Germany. The logistical challenge of establishing forward airfields closer to the front lines was immense, fraught with strategic risks and resource drains. The Luftwaffe's strategy was clear: allow the initial escort to engage, then strike hard once the American fighters were forced to disengage. Interrogation files from captured American airmen consistently revealed a common sentiment: the dread of the turn-back point. This invisible line in the sky marked the end of their protection, a psychological and tactical boundary that the German fighter pilots understood intimately. Their own aircraft, while possessing comparable or slightly less internal fuel capacity, operated from airfields directly beneath the bomber streams, allowing them to engage, refuel, and re-engage with relative ease. The strategic advantage of interior lines of communication and supply was undeniable, making every mile flown by the Allied escorts a hard-won, fuel-costly effort. The constant aerial battles over the Reich demanded a different kind of endurance, a long-range capability that simply did not exist in the Allied fighter arm. The bombers, designed for payload and defensive firepower, were not built for sustained evasion or individual combat against dedicated interceptors. Their survival depended entirely on the presence of their smaller, faster companions, a presence that was, by design, fleeting. England, late 1943, the P-51 Mustang, a sleek new American fighter, began to arrive in numbers, offering a glimmer of hope against the Luftwaffe's continued dominance over the continent. Its Packard V1650 Merlin engine, a license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, granted it exceptional performance at altitude, a critical advantage in the bomber escort role. However, initial deployments quickly revealed a significant operational constraint. Its internal fuel capacity, while respectable for a fighter, was insufficient to accompany bomber formations deep into Germany. The Mustang's primary internal fuel tanks, two self-sealing units located in the wings, held a combined 184 U.S. gallons. This provided a combat radius of approximately 500 miles, enough to reach targets in northern France or the Low Countries, but far short of the industrial heartland of the Reich. Early mission reports from the 8th Air Force consistently highlighted the P-51's inability to provide continuous escort beyond the German border, leaving the B-17s and B-24s vulnerable during the most dangerous phases of their long-range missions. Engineers at North American Aviation had designed the P-51 with provision for auxiliary fuel tanks, but these were initially conceived for ferry flights or short-duration tactical missions. The standard solution, 75-gallon metal drop tanks, were a stopgap measure. These tanks, fabricated from sheet aluminum, were aerodynamic but heavy, reducing maneuverability and speed when carried. Their limited capacity also meant they had to be jettisoned relatively early in a mission, still leaving a substantial portion of the bomber route uncovered. A more radical solution was needed, one that could extend the Mustang's reach without excessively penalizing performance. The concept of a non-metallic, expendable fuel tank began to gain traction. Materials engineers explored options beyond aluminum, focusing on lightweight, low-cost alternatives that could be mass-produced and then discarded. The strategic imperative was clear: keep the fighters with the bombers, no matter the distance. The answer arrived in the form of a 108-gallon papier-mâché drop tank. These tanks, constructed from compressed and resin-impregnated paper, were significantly lighter and cheaper to produce than their metal counterparts. Their larger capacity provided the crucial additional fuel, pushing the Mustang's combat radius closer to the 800-mile mark. Production logs indicate that by early 1944, thousands of these paper tanks were being shipped weekly to England. The adoption of these larger, expendable tanks transformed the P-51 from a capable regional fighter into a true long-range escort. Pilots could now carry 208-gallon tanks, effectively doubling their usable fuel. This allowed them to remain with the bomber streams all the way to targets deep within Germany, engaging the Luftwaffe over their home territory. The initial skepticism among some German fighter pilots, who had grown accustomed to American escorts turning back at the perceived limit of their range, would soon be replaced by a grim realization. Fighter Command, England, early 1944. The necessity of deeper penetration into German airspace had become an unyielding mandate, a strategic imperative driven by the unsustainable losses of unescorted bomber formations. The P-51B and P-51C, with their laminar flow wings and potent Merlin engines, possessed the speed and altitude capability to challenge the Luftwaffe. But their internal fuel capacity, a mere 184 gallons, limited their combat radius to approximately 550 miles. This operational constraint meant that bomber streams often flew the most dangerous segments of their missions deep over the Reich, without fighter cover, a vulnerability exploited with ruthless efficiency by German interceptors. The solution emerged from the seemingly mundane problem of auxiliary fuel carriage, the jettisonable external drop tank. Early attempts at external tanks, often constructed from metal, were heavy, complex, and prone to rupture under combat stresses. These initial designs, while extending range, imposed significant aerodynamic penalties and were often discarded prematurely, negating their intended benefit. The innovation required a shift in material science and manufacturing technique, moving beyond the traditional aluminum alloys. Engineers at North American Aviation, in collaboration with the U.S. Army Air Forces, pursued a radical alternative: molded paper and plywood. These composite tanks, often referred to as paper tanks, were essentially large streamlined bladders constructed from resin-impregnated paper or laminated wood veneers. Their production involved winding layers of treated paper or thin plywood strips over a mandrel, then curing the assembly under heat and pressure to create a rigid yet lightweight structure. These tanks typically held either 75 or 108 gallons of aviation fuel. The material choice offered distinct advantages. Paper and plywood tanks were significantly lighter than their metal counterparts, reducing the overall weight penalty on the aircraft. Their manufacturing process was also less resource-intensive, requiring fewer strategic materials like aluminum, which were in high demand for primary aircraft construction. More critically, their low cost and expendable nature meant pilots were encouraged to jettison them at the first sign of combat, unburdening the aircraft for optimal maneuverability and speed. With two 108-gallon drop tanks, the P-51's total fuel capacity surged to 400 gallons, nearly a 120% increase over its internal stores alone. This seemingly simple addition transformed the P-51's combat radius from 550 miles to over 850 miles, pushing its effective reach deep into Germany, far beyond the Ruhr and into the heart of the industrial centers around Berlin. The quantitative impact was immediate. A P-51 could now escort bombers to targets previously considered unreachable, engage defending fighters, and return to base with fuel reserves. The strategic implication was profound. Bomber crews, previously resigned to the gauntlet of unescorted deep penetrations, now saw Mustang formations accompanying them all the way to the target area and back. The psychological effect on both sides was palpable. German pilots, accustomed to engaging unmolested bomber streams after the shorter-ranged escorts turned back, now found themselves confronted by agile, long-legged fighters with a full complement of ammunition. This shift in operational capability directly translated into a measurable reduction in bomber losses. As documented in APE Air Force damage reports from early 1944, the skies over Germany were no longer a sanctuary. The winter of 1943-44 saw a subtle but significant shift in the air war over Germany. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to engaging American bombers, largely unescorted or with short-legged P-47s and P-38s, began reporting encounters with P-51 Mustangs much deeper into the Reich. These early sightings, often dismissed as reconnaissance probes or navigational errors, presaged a fundamental change in the strategic bombing campaign. The P-51B and C models, now equipped with the Merlin engine, possessed a combat radius previously unseen in Allied single-engine fighters. This was not a consequence of internal fuel capacity alone, but rather the widespread adoption of external, jettisonable fuel tanks. These drop tanks, initially constructed from papier-mâché or plywood, were engineered to be aerodynamic, minimizing drag while maximizing fuel carriage. A typical 75-gallon drop tank, roughly cylindrical with tapered ends, added approximately 450 pounds of fuel weight, extending the Mustang's operational range by several hundred miles. Production logs indicate that by early 1944, thousands of these tanks were being manufactured weekly in various Allied facilities, a testament to their strategic importance. The material composition, often a resin-impregnated paper pulp, allowed for rapid, inexpensive production and easy disposal once empty. This extended reach meant that bomber formations, once forced to fend for themselves over targets like Schweinfurt or Regensburg, now had fighter protection for the entire outbound and return journey. The psychological impact on both bomber crews and German defenders was profound. Interrogation files reveal increasing bewilderment among captured Luftwaffe pilots who spoke of Mustangs appearing out of nowhere over central Germany, far beyond their expected patrol limits. The strategic implication was immediate and devastating for the Luftwaffe. Their interceptor tactics, which relied on concentrating forces against unescorted bombers deep within German airspace, were rendered obsolete. Now, German fighters had to contend with agile, long-range escorts throughout the engagement, often finding themselves at a disadvantage in terms of fuel and numbers. The shift in air combat dynamics was quantifiable. Damage reports from late 1943 and early 1944 show a marked increase in engagements between German interceptors and P-51s over targets previously considered safe havens for bomber attacks. The very presence of these fighters forced the Luftwaffe to engage on terms dictated by the Allies, eroding their ability to inflict decisive losses on bomber streams. The P-51, with its new endurance, transformed from a tactical fighter into a strategic weapon, effectively shrinking the vastness of German airspace. The industrial heartland, once a distant objective, was now within reach of persistent, aggressive fighter cover. This extended reach brought the air war directly to the German aircraft factories and airfields, challenging the Luftwaffe on its own ground. The American 8th Air Force, recognizing the profound advantage, began leveraging the P-51's range to actively hunt German fighters rather than simply defending bombers. This transition to an offensive fighter sweep strategy enabled by the drop tanks marked a new, more aggressive phase of the air war. The skies over Germany were no longer a sanctuary. Over the German heartland, the P-51 Mustangs, no longer tethered by range anxieties, began to hunt. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to engaging bombers, largely unescorted beyond the Rhine, now found themselves facing agile, fast opponents deep within their own defensive zones. The shift was immediate and brutal as American fighter groups, once forced to turn back, pressed the attack, often catching German interceptors on their return to base. Low on fuel and ammunition, after engaging the bomber streams, the P-51B and C models, now equipped with the Packard V1650-7 Merlin engine, offered a speed advantage at altitude that few German fighters could consistently match. The Focke-Wulf FW-190A series, while formidable at lower altitudes and in a dive, struggled to maintain energy against the Mustang above 25,000 feet, where many engagements occurred. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G series, particularly the later models, could climb with the Mustang, but its limited internal fuel capacity meant shorter combat endurance compared to the P-51 with its external tanks. Interrogation files from captured Luftwaffe pilots frequently cited the shock of encountering Mustangs far east of previous operational limits. A common lament described the unending waves of American fighters, a perception directly attributable to the extended loiter times and deeper penetration capabilities. Production logs indicate that by mid-1944, the average sortie length for a P-51 escort mission had nearly doubled from early 1943, often exceeding 5 hours. This sustained presence forced the Luftwaffe into a dilemma: commit their dwindling fighter forces to engage the escorts, thus exposing their bomber-hunting formations to heavy losses, or attempt to bypass the Mustangs and face the heavily armed bomber boxes. Neither option was sustainable. Fuel consumption rates for German interceptors were high, and their airfields, now within easy range of the P-51s, became targets of opportunity. Damage reports from the 8th Air Force show a dramatic increase in enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat over Germany. In January 1944, before widespread P-51 deployment with drop tanks, the 8th Air Force claimed 178 enemy aircraft destroyed. By March 1944, with the Mustangs routinely reaching Berlin, this number surged to 604, a direct consequence of the sustained presence over German airspace. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. The sanctuary of their home skies had evaporated. The strategic implications were clear. The Luftwaffe could no longer effectively defend its industrial heartland or its synthetic fuel plants without suffering unsustainable losses. The air superiority battle had decisively shifted, not through a single technological leap, but through the synergistic application of existing technology, the drop tank, to an already capable airframe. The skies over Germany, once a formidable barrier, had become a hunting ground. The relentless escort missions, now extending deep into the Reich, began to dismantle the Luftwaffe's capacity for coordinated defense. Damage reports from February 1944 onward show a steep decline in German fighter strength, not just in aircraft numbers, but in the availability of experienced pilots. The attrition rate became unsustainable, with new pilots thrown into combat with insufficient training, often against seasoned American veterans. Interrogation files from captured German airmen frequently detail the demoralizing effect of the P-51's omnipresence. They spoke of the psychological strain of knowing that even after engaging bombers, they would then have to contend with a fresh wave of escorts, often at higher altitudes and with superior speed. Production logs indicate that while aircraft factories continued to churn out new fighters, the quality of their pilots was demonstrably inferior, leading to a higher rate of operational losses. The strategic consequence was profound. Bomber formations, once vulnerable after crossing the Rhine, now enjoyed protection all the way to targets like Berlin, Leipzig, or Dresden. This sustained pressure prevented the Luftwaffe from massing its remaining forces effectively, as any concentration would inevitably attract swarms of P-51s. The German High Command's efforts to rebuild fighter groups were continuously undermined by the constant engagement. Unit diaries from Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 27, once formidable units, show a marked decrease in sortie rates and a corresponding increase in combat fatigue. The fuel consumed in desperate attempts to intercept bomber streams, often resulting in no engagement due to the P-51 screen, further depleted already strained resources. The industrial heartland of Germany, once relatively safe from precision daylight bombing, was now exposed. The ideological implication for the German war effort was devastating. The promise of an impenetrable aerial defense, a core tenet of Nazi propaganda, crumbled under the weight of sustained P-51 escort. The civilian population, witnessing the relentless bomber streams and the diminished response from their own air force, began to question the efficacy of their leadership. The air war, once a distant threat, became a daily reality of destruction. The inability to protect critical infrastructure meant that factories, rail lines, and oil refineries were systematically degraded. This material damage, coupled with the psychological impact of constant aerial attack, eroded the very foundations of the German war machine. The sky, once a domain of German pride, had become a conduit for their destruction. The spring of 1944 brought a stark, undeniable change to the skies over the Reich. German fighter production, despite the relentless Allied bombing campaigns, actually peaked in September 1944, reaching an astonishing 3,980 single-engine fighters that month. This raw output, however, masked a catastrophic hemorrhaging of experienced pilots and the essential fuel to train and fly them. Unit diaries from Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 54 reveal an alarming trend. Newly assigned pilots possessed an average of fewer than 100 hours of flight time, often with as little as 20 hours in the actual combat type they were expected to fly. This contrasted sharply with the 300 to 500 hours routinely logged by their Allied counterparts before entering combat. The qualitative gap widened with every passing week. Fuel shortages became acute, crippling training programs and restricting combat sorties. Interrogation files from captured Luftwaffe personnel consistently cited a lack of high-octane aviation fuel as a primary impediment to operations. The synthetic fuel plants, despite robust defenses, were systematically targeted and their output choked. The strategic implications were devastating. With fewer, less experienced pilots and insufficient fuel, the Luftwaffe's ability to intercept the deep penetration bomber formations and their escort fighters diminished to a critical point. Damage reports from 8th Air Force bomber groups show a steady decline in the number of attacking German fighters encountered per mission, even as the bomber stream grew larger. The once feared formations of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, which had inspired such dread, became increasingly rare sightings. When they did appear, they were often flown by young men with minimal combat experience, unable to contend with the seasoned Allied pilots in their long-range P-51s and P-47s. The numerical superiority of the Allies, combined with their qualitative edge in pilot training and operational tempo, created an inescapable vortex for the German air arm. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer a coherent fighting force capable of contesting air superiority. Its remnants were relegated to desperate, often suicidal, intercept missions against overwhelming odds. The sky above Germany, once a contested battleground, had become an Allied domain. The shattered remnants of the Luftwaffe, once a formidable force, lay strewn across the European theater. Allied intelligence reports, compiled from captured documents and interrogations, confirmed the devastating impact of the P-51's extended reach. The attrition rates for German fighter units, already high, accelerated dramatically in the final year of the war, directly correlating with the increased penetration of Mustang escorts. Damage assessments from the spring of 1945 indicated that over 80% of Germany's operational airfields had been rendered unusable by sustained Allied bombing, much of it executed under the protective canopy of P-51s. The strategic bombing campaign, once hampered by insufficient escort, now struck with unprecedented precision and impunity. Production logs from Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf factories showed a precipitous decline in fighter output, not merely from bombing, but from the chronic shortages of skilled labor and critical materials, exacerbated by the constant threat from above. The ideological underpinnings of the Blitzkrieg, which relied on air superiority to enable rapid ground advances, had been utterly dismantled. German ground forces, deprived of air cover and reconnaissance, faced an Allied advance supported by overwhelming aerial power. Unit diaries from the Ardennes offensive, for instance, frequently lamented the omnipresence of Allied fighters, often specifically naming the P-51 as a primary threat to their movements and supply lines. The psychological toll on German pilots was immense. Interrogation files revealed a widespread sense of futility, a recognition that the skies belonged irrevocably to the Allies. The once confident sneers had long since vanished, replaced by a grim acceptance of their numerical and technological inferiority. The P-51, once underestimated, had become the symbol of an inescapable aerial dominance. The strategic implications extended beyond direct combat. The ability of the P-51 to escort bombers deep into German territory forced the Luftwaffe to divert precious resources to homeland defense, weakening their capacity to support the beleaguered ground forces on the eastern and western fronts. This diversion of effort, documented in German high command directives from late 1944, significantly contributed to the overall collapse of the German war machine. The P-51's operational range, fueled by the simple yet revolutionary addition of external drop tanks,